Well met, everyone. I am Rich the Lich, and in today's video I want to talk to you about what are some really good monster options that you can use to kickstart your campaign. We're not talking about a one-shot. We're not talking about just a few sessions where you're trying to introduce your players to D&D, or you're just trying to see if you're the best fit for the group to be the Dungeon Master. Because in those cases, when it's going to kind of be one and done or just a few weekends of play, use whatever monsters are most exciting. What we are talking about here is when you are going to start a campaign. So we are talking about session 1. What monster do you pull from the book? Do you stat up? What miniature do you paint to be ready to throw onto the table to kickstart your campaign with a bang, to get your players excited? What are the right ones? What are the best ones? Well, as with all things D&D, there is no right, no wrong, no best, no only. But I'm going to talk through 3 options to kickstart your campaign right out of the gate. The first one is a villain. Okay, we're going to talk at these sort of 3 umbrellas: a villain, a boss, and just a really cool encounter for that session. Which monsters you pick that fit underneath those categories is entirely up to you. A villain can be a vampire, it can be a troll, it can be a human, it can be a dragon, right? Likewise, a nuisance for the session, just a simple encounter that's really exciting, it can also be a troll or a giant or a dragon or whatever it may be. So you need to decide which monsters fit. But if you think about what their role is in the overarching campaign and the overall story, I think you'll be better equipped to figure out what are the best ones to bring to my table to get started. The villain, Strahd, right? I think the big separator between a villain and the other two being a boss and sort of a one-time encounter for this session, a villain is something that at first they're sort of untouchable. They're either just too powerful, their AC is too high, the PCs can't hit them. They are almost immune to all damage that's not from a magical source, and your PCs don't have any magic weapons. They hit too hard, they're going to drop your tanks in one round and kill your rogues and your wizards right afterwards. They heal through all the damage that is being dealt, right? So just literal, your group is level 1, you introduce a villain that's CR 13, this guy's out of reach, okay? But maybe the villain is someone that they don't even have access to. This villain, she's sealed at the bottom of this dungeon, and the PCs need to go through a lot of steps, a lot of sessions, a lot of game time to figure out the puzzle, the clues, the secrets, to unlock all the doors, to unseal all of the locks, and so on and so forth, to even get to the villain. But more importantly than making the villain unkillable or inaccessible, is the villain is also the type of monster, creature, whatever, the entity, and it can be a whole group. A faction can be a villain, and that's maybe for another interesting video. But the villain, they're the puppet master. They're pulling the strings from a distance. Their machinations, what they are doing day to day, their goals, their wants, their desires, their agenda is creating this ripple effect. And everything underneath them is causing constant problems for the PCs, right? The thorn in the side of your PCs, in everything they do, when they go to a tavern and they simply just want some warm bread and some stew and a good drink, but there is no good ale. The dwarf in your party is pissed because there's no ale. And you know why? Because some creature, some group of bandits stole the shipment of ale. And guess who's funding and paying for the group of bandits? The villain. Your PCs, your wizards, are low on spells. They need to long rest. They go out into the wilds, or they're out in the wilds, and they need to rest. But there's just an influx of howling wolves and bears, but these things look almost more dire, right? Yeah, you have a fight there, but the ranger in the group is like, there's these really like aggressive monsters, like, or animals, beasts, and they won't let us sleep. They keep encroaching upon our camp, right? They're hungry. And then you find out that something the villain is doing is causing all of these beasts to be rabid. Maybe you actually introduce the villain. The PCs actually run into this individual, this entity. He, she, it, whatever it may be. And as I said, it's just too powerful. The PCs know that. Maybe the villain takes something from them. Maybe he kidnaps one of the PCs. maybe they just see the villain, but the villain always has to get away. Early on, at least, right? To create a villain, you need to establish these stacking sets of just assholery, or whatever you want to call it. Just things that keep stacking on top of each other. Moments in the game that just keep causing problems for your PCs. Right? Oh, the villain did this. Asshole. The villain did that. The villain sucks. He's so frustrating. And then the villain got away. That just drives me nuts. And then the villain took something from the PCs. Oh my gosh, are you serious? And then the NPC that the PCs were supposed to talk to is gone because of the villain. And you keep stacking these things, and your PCs just build more and more hate. But the beauty lies in the more and more they hate him, the more frustrated they get that they can't just confront the villain. They still don't have access to it yet, or they're still not, especially if they're not powerful enough yet. Because this villain keeps doing these things, but they don't have control to do anything about it. They're not strong enough. So that is one good way that you can kickstart your campaign, is introduce some kind of villain. Obviously, Ravenloft, Curse of Strahd, it does that, right? In spades, it has it. You introduce the big bad boss vampire, whatever it may be. Now remember, there's multiple layers of villain. If it's an ancient red dragon and you're starting your group at level 1, this is a villain that persists. You may have sort of sub-villains, right? Because the true interaction, basically stopping the ancient red dragon from becoming a nuisance, is going to take a while. So you need to decide if you want to introduce the villain that the PCs will confront in 17 levels. That's 3 years of frustration for them. So you need to kind of weave through that. They can still be a villain and be an orc. Okay? So that's kind of one category of what monster you might bring to the table. Again, letting you choose what falls within that category. The second category is there's a boss. This is a tough fight. Most likely beyond the range of what your PCs are capable of right now. Introducing the boss has some similarities to the villain in that they're inaccessible right now, right? For many reasons. Maybe they're just sealed away somewhere that the PCs don't have access to. This boss lives in a cave in a swamp, but the swamp is so damn deadly the PCs have no business going there right now. Or they're just unkillable, okay? But the big difference is they're more approachable, and they're going to interact with this big boss, this tough, really difficult fight, soonish. Maybe not, it's not going to happen this session, but within the first sort of story arc, within the first few sessions, they take down the boss. And the interesting thing is when the boss can actually be sort of the sub-villain to the main villain, right? So at some point, they're going to interact with this boss, and they're going to be able to take him, her, it down, all right? The other thing is the boss does not have a bunch of moving parts underneath it. Like all of the obstacles that are being presented to the group are not attributed to the boss as they would be to the villain, right? The PCs go into the tavern and they find out there's no ale because someone is stealing the ale shipments. That's not the boss's fault. The boss has nothing to do with it, right? There's a kidnapping. Just another hiccup that slows the group down, that throws them on a different path, that gives them another quest that they have to tackle before they can get back to the main quest. That's not because of the boss. The boss is just the tough thing that they need to deal with later. And then the third category is kickstart your session with a damn good fight for that session. A really good encounter. And there's a lot of ways you can go through this. I think this one can be the most interesting for me because I don't need to, the suspense doesn't need to last that long. I get to see how this plays out right now. Like I'm going to introduce this guy maybe early on or somewhere in the session, but whatever it may be, within 5 hours of that session, we're throwing down with this guy. I've already painted this miniature. Okay, I already have the terrain of where they're going to encounter this fight. Now, you need to tread through whether it's a deadly fight or an easy fight or whatever, but you can have a very exciting fight. A fight that maybe means something later on. They find a key item on it that leads to a boss or to a villain. Maybe they find a key item that is one of 5 parts of the epic sword that your paladin is eventually going to want. Now, it doesn't have to have long-standing ramifications and consequences and whatnot. It can just simply be a fight. This is also a good opportunity, and why I think this might be of most value. It might be a good opportunity for you and your players to get a feel for what combat is like in this edition. in what combat is like in this world. It might give some players that are on the fence of they're not sure if they should have picked a wizard or if they chose correctly in picking the barbarian. Throwing a fight in there is a good way to get the feelers out, right? They learn very quickly, I don't know, I didn't do anything. I just charged and that's all I did. I just kept, roll a die and I don't have a lot of options. And I know at level 1 you're not going to have a lot of options anyway, but you give players a chance to kind of scrap their characters. And one of the best ways for a player to really decide and seal in their character and say, this is who or what I want to play, is through combat, because 5th edition is very combat heavy. If your player does not move in the way that you want it to in combat, yeah, you can have an awesome backstory and some really cool role play in there, but you're probably not going to like the character, because combat can be a very big part of the game. So sometimes just throwing in a sort of quick encounter, a quick fight, okay? That's a good thing that you can do. So there's sort of your 3 categories. Which is the best? You need to weave through that. You can have the quick encounter lead to the boss, which leads to the villain. So in some way you have like a subsection of each of them all rearing their head during that first session. But there is no right, there's no wrong, no best way. You have to weave through that. It just depends on what you're going for. Here's a good way to think of it. Forget about the categories, villain, boss, or just a kind of quick encounter. What's the vibe you're trying to sell your players on in the first session? Are you trying to sell them on the vibe of the edition? So D&D? Here's what fantasy is like. Here's the way I play. Here's how gritty and realistic and hard I am. How difficult I make the game. Or are you trying to sell them on something of the world? The world is dark and grim. The world is full of despair and hopelessness. The world is, the section at least, or the part of the world where you're in, is very happy-go-lucky. And then from that, you can kind of either reinforce that vibe, that energy, depending on whether you pick a villain, a boss, or a regular fight. Or you can completely slap them in the face and say, here's a boss that goes against everything that you guys thought should occur in the area that you're in. A boss fight that happens in their home, in the sanctity or the safety of their castle, right? There's an invasion that happens. Like, you're setting the stage right there of saying the places you think are safe are not really as safe as you think. So there it is. That's what you can weave through for your fights and what monsters, creatures, things from the book you may want to use. You can also just flip through it and find a pretty picture and say, this is who I want to introduce to my players. That's all I have. See you guys.